Welcome guys, this is Brian from the SE Optimist, and I've gotten a lot of requests from different people I've worked with and done consulting for about how to use the Divi Builder that I use, and so I wanted to do some instructional content with screen capture, and I'm going to break this into two parts. The first part, the first video that we're talking about right now, is going to cover how you set up Divi and install it, and then some of the basic features on the back end of WordPress here that you can use, like the theme customizer and set some default settings for the site. And then in part two of the video, which will probably be a longer one, we're going to get hands-on with the actual Divi Builder itself. The page builder is what you would control the midsection of it. It's not necessarily the navigation that we see up here, and it's not your footer content down at the bottom. It's everything in the page itself and what that looks like. So that's going to be part two. Okay, if you paid for the Divi theme, you probably were able to get a download link and download a zip file. On the back end of WordPress, you would go under Appearance and then Themes, and if you didn't have this here, you would say Add New, and then by default it goes to the WordPress repository. We instead say we want to upload theme, and then it's going to ask you to find on your computer where that zip file was. You click this and you find it, and then you click the Install Now button. Once it's installed, you'll be taken back to this themes page where you probably have Divi in addition to other themes that you might have currently installed. You want to select Divi and say Activate so that that's the active theme that your site is using. The first thing you're going to want to do after you do that is to go all the way down on this bar here to where it says Divi and the top option, Theme Options. This is a section you probably won't be going back to often after this, but there are a couple preliminary things that we do want to set up in here. When I set up sites with Divi, the very first thing I do is go to Updates over here, and you see where it has username and API key. After you bought the Divi Builder, you probably got an email that had some of this information in it. You were able to set up a username when you made the account on the site to download it, and then they'll email you an API key. You would put both of those things in here. What this does is basically just proves that you've paid for a legit copy of Divi, so that anytime your WordPress installation checks for updates to plugins and themes, when it tries to connect to the server to get the newest version of Divi, it's going to use this information to prove to the server that you are entitled to those updates. If it can't do that, it won't let you do the updates. Now, one strange little bug I've noticed a few times while doing this is when you put this information in and hit save, for some reason it does save the information there. Like, you can come back to this page and see it, but when you try to do your first update, it will act as though you haven't done this. I'm not sure why that is, but there's a weird fix that I figured out, which is as simple as click save and wait for it to say that it's saved, and then click save a second time. I don't know why that makes a difference, but for some reason clicking it twice locks it in, and then when you do your first round of updates, you won't have any problems. One other thing you can do when you're in here is under integration, where it says add code to the head tag of your blog. This would be for things like your Google Analytics account, your Search Console verifications. If you have any other codes for tracking and other stuff that you want to use and put in here, you can paste that code right in this box, and that will automatically put that code into your site for you everywhere on every page of the site where it's going to be needed. That's very easy, and then you can just scroll down here and click save. Now on this part, you don't have to click it twice. Once is sufficient. Scroll back up. One other thing that I would say you want to look at right away when you've just installed Divi is to go to General. You see here where it says Logo. Click the Upload button, and it's going to take you to your media gallery. You can either pick an image that you already have in WordPress for your logo, or say Upload, and it'll be the same deal. You're going to find it from your computer and then upload it. And then you can hit Save. It's going to use the logo on the upper left area of the site here automatically to whatever image that you decided to use, and we can do some more settings for how it's going to display the logo in the next part of what we're going to talk about, but we do have to declare the logo here so that it knows. One other thing I want to point out, some of these settings you might not need unless you're doing specific things, but this is useful for everyone, where it says Color Picker's Default Palette. Basically, when we get to part 2 where we're working in the actual page builder itself, everywhere that we're going to be able to pick colors, you can manually enter hex codes or use the color swatch and manually pick colors yourself. But if you're in a position where you know going into this, there's going to be a couple of your brand colors that you're going to be using a lot, and you don't want to have to keep finding just the right hex code over and over again, what you can do is, say instead of this blue, I can click it. Say one of my brand colors is a different shade of blue, say like a really dark blue like this. Say that's my hex code that I want to use. Now when I click away, it's going to lock that in. So now it took the place of the blue that was already there. And what this basically does is anytime, like I said, we go into where you can pick colors, it's going to start you with this little string palette. And now you don't have to waste your time finding that exact color or typing in this code every time. You can just click this blue, bam, you're done. And you do that for a couple of different colors that you're going to be using all the time. It just saves time and it makes it convenient to have some go-to colors for things that you're going to use in your theme. This option, grab the first post image, is mostly for blog posts. You notice when you share things on Facebook and other social media, how it often will show like a preview image alongside that blog post. Well, if you've ever wondered how does it determine what image it's going to show, it does it usually in one of two ways. If you're into post settings, you notice on the lower right-hand side where it says featured image, usually anything you set as the featured image, it's going to grab when you share it on social media. But in case some of your posts don't have a specifically declared featured image, if you activate this setting, it'll basically just tell WordPress, if I haven't told you a specific featured image, just grab whatever the first image you happen to see in the body content of that post and just use that one for when people share the content. I have it disabled because I make it a point generally to always declare a featured image, so I don't need it. But if I had already been blogging for a long time before I learned that I needed to do a featured image, and I'm like, at this point, I don't want to go back and edit 75 posts, this would be useful to put on, and then I know if people share any of my previous whole bunch of posts, they're at least going to get some kind of image and it'll look better. This by default is where you can designate on the default template for pages where the sidebar is. Generally, you'd probably want to leave it on right. That's the most common setup. Although we probably won't be doing a whole lot with this because with the Divi page builder, we're going to be controlling everything on the pages. Pretty much the only time you're going to see Divi's default page template used is, say, on blog posts, on archive pages. If you have WooCommerce, it'll use aspects of this theme on product and store pages that you can't use the builder on per se. Let's see. Use Google Fonts allows you to basically use embedded fonts that aren't necessarily standard to a Windows or a Mac PC, and the advantage of that is that you can pick fonts like, say, Open Sans and know that it's going to display properly for anyone who comes to your site because it will actually embed that font in your site, so the font gets loaded as they load your site, and then whether they actually have that font or not on their computer, it will display like it should for your site. I generally leave that on. That's a cool feature. These are just options to show various social icons in the lower right. I'll click back over here and go to the bottom so you can see. It would put them right here. I've currently told it not to show any of them on my site, but this is where it would put them as little icons if you had that selected. And then you can pick which one of them you want to show. And then for any of them that you have told it that you want to show, on these lines is where you would paste the URL to your channel. So if you had a Facebook business page, here's where you would paste the URL to your business page, your Twitter profile, Google+, Instagram, etc. If you want people to be able to subscribe to your site via an RSS feed, this is where you would put that URL. Generally, by default with WordPress, the URL to that is just whatever the web address of your site is /feed. And it'll be pretty much the same for anyone with WordPress. These are settings for if you have archive pages where it's showing blog posts by categories and stuff, how many of the posts do you want to show at a time before they have to click an arrow for next. This is a judgment call. Sometimes you might want to extend this to maybe 10 so that they have more choices at once without having to scroll through multiple pages. But of course, to take note that the more things you're making load on a page at once, the slower the page will load, which is why some people keep it at a lower number so that the pages load more quickly for users that don't necessarily need to see a big number of them at once. That's entirely up to you. Here's where you control the date format that you want to show for posts. By default, I believe it's the month and then the year. If you want to change that, you can click this and it will give you some information and you can read about their shortcodes for how that differs. Most of these things you can pretty much leave exactly how it comes. This section down here appears two places. You can access it here and in the customizer that we're about to look at. Basically, this custom CSS is if you want to make changes to the way certain things look in Divi and on your pages that are not things that you happen to be able to do in the builder or the customizer, that you can only accomplish with code overrides, and you're comfortable enough with CSS to do those overrides, you can put those in here and then it will apply them. I don't generally do much editing here. We'll do that in the customizer that we'll look at in just a second. All right, so to go to the customizer, we go to right here, theme customizer. Now this is kind of handy because it's going to give us a lot of settings for defaults on how things look on the site that aren't specific to like elements and rows. And it will actually load our site so that we can see any changes that we're making happen in real time. Generally, you would start with the general settings. Site identity is just going to be what the site is actually called. And if you have a tagline, you can put it there. There's not a whole lot to do other than that. You can change the site icon image if you want. As you can see up in your browser tabs, that's the little icon that shows when people are browsing your site. If you click change image, it'll go to your media gallery just like we've done with the logo, and you can pick a little file. If you don't have one yet and you don't want to do this, you don't have to worry about that. So we'll click back here. Layout settings is basically how wide you want your content width to be. I believe the default is 1080. A lot of the time, if you're not sure what to do here, you can leave a lot of these settings the way that they came. Website gutter width is just basically how much of a gap there's going to be between the corners of the site and individual elements in the columns of things that you do. You can play with this, sliding it left and right to see the difference that it makes. This is another one that if you're not really sure, just leave it alone for the time being. I check use custom sidebar width. Let me go to a blog page so that you can see the sidebar in action, so this will make more sense. All right, let me click this post. Okay, so you can see this is the default Divi template I was mentioning before. This is what things like blog posts look like when we're not using the Divi page builder. So it has your title here and then your content, and then it's going to display a sidebar on the side. This is normally quite a bit narrower, so when I say custom sidebar width, any number that you put in here is a percentage, right? I have it set at 30, so what that's telling it is 30% of the horizontal width of the screen devote to the sidebar, and then whatever's left gets to the main content. I like 30. It's a little bit wider than how it comes by default, just so that this doesn't look cramped. Section height and row height are kind of like the gutter width. You can drag those back and forth to see how things reshape on the page. Generally, I leave those alone. Theme accent color is going to affect things like where there's little visual additives in different places. I think it might affect link colors and stuff if you haven't declared a separate link color, which I always do. Generally, I leave that by default because I mostly control the colors in a more hands-on way when I'm building. Okay, let's go back. Typography. This is another good one to start with. Body text size. This is the default size for all of your body text, for pages and especially for blog posts. This is in, it doesn't say it, but it's in pixels. That doesn't necessarily have to mean a whole lot to you. Just know that I think it starts at 14 or 16 by default. If you click this, it'll go back to default. You can either change the number manually in there, or you can click this slider and start dragging it up. You can see as I drag it up, it makes the text progressively bigger. This is a personal preference. Bigger text tends to be punchier and stand out better. It can be easier to read, but of course, if it's too big, you can run into issues where it doesn't always look good, especially on mobile. And of course, bear in mind, For subheadings and things to stand out well, their size proportioned to the body text needs to be a certain amount bigger. So the bigger you make the body text, the bigger you're going to have to make subheadings. So let's drag this back down to say 20 now, just for demonstration purposes. Body line height. This is how much space there is between each line of text. You notice if I drag this up and down, see how the text becomes denser looking and close together? And then if you drag it up, it gets further. This is a balancing act as well. You don't want it to be too dense because that's hard to read. But if you go up too high, you notice that it starts to get kind of hard to tell the difference between when a paragraph ends and another one begins and just regular lines, and that's not ideal. So if we drag this back down, notice how that's more of a situation where there is some useful white space between the lines, but this gap between paragraphs is still notable, and that ends up being easier to read. I usually use about 1.8. Currently we're at 2. I find that for this width of content to be pretty comfortable to read. Note, though, that the wider your content area is, the more useful it is to have additional line height to keep it easy to read. The denser it is, the harder it is for a person's eye when they get to an end of a line to return to the beginning of the next line. So just bear that in mind. This is where we talk about header text size by default. This is going to be for your titles here. If I drag this up, you'll notice that that gets bigger. And you can do the same thing with line height for your titles as well. And by default, you can set styles to your headers if you don't want it to be bold, if you want it to be italic and things like that. I believe I have some other CSS code controlling what this looks like, which is why toggling these isn't changing it. But you do notice that it did change these over here because technically these are heading 3s. You can change the header font. I have it set as Roboto. That's one of the embedded fonts that you can use, and my body font is Open Sans. So if I change this away to something else, you can see how it makes a difference on the font there. This is your default body link color. Anytime you use a link, you can see this blue, how it's reflected there. That's your body text color. Some people like to use a dark gray just for something different. I generally go all the way to full-on black. I just find on a white background, it's dark, it's heavy, it's easy to read. In my opinion, that's just the best option. I generally do that on all of my sites, but you don't have to. You can make it whatever you want. You can make it a gray. You could make it colors if you want to do that, whatever you like. And again, you're seeing that, remember when I mentioned those color swatches where we can define defaults in there? This is the first example of where you can see that in action. And so if I had, say I wanted to make my, click away from this. If I wanted to make my header text color one of my brand colors, if I clicked this, ones that I designated would be right in here, and it would be easy to just click it. Okay, so let's go back out of here. Background you would really only do if you want a set background color. It's often overridden by other things on the page, though, that you're doing. As you can see, this is set to blue, and yet we don't actually see any blue, so that's usually why I don't worry about any of that there. You can set a background image to go over the whole page if you want. Generally, I don't find that to be a good design tactic. It can often look tacky, and it creates a lot of issues with how you make the different text and other visual elements you're doing look good over it. I find that that just creates a whole new layer of complexity to what you're doing that you're better off just with a clean look generally. Okay, footer is another thing. Header and navigation. So, header style. Default is probably what most people would use, but you can say centered. If you want a format where your logo is on top and then your menu items are just below it, that is kind of a cool look. If you want it to be centered, but you want your logo to be in the middle of your navigation, you can do it that way. Slide in basically means it's just your logo and it doesn't show the menu until someone clicks this to pop it in. I don't really care for that style, but it might work with some designs. And full screen is kind of like the default, except it's going to take up the whole width. Generally, I would probably go with one of the first 3. My site, as you saw, is using default. If you want a vertical navigation, like where it goes down the side here, you can click that box. And if you are in a position where you actually don't want the navigation to even show up until a person scrolls down, you can click that. Primary menu bar is this one right here that you're looking at. If you click Make Full Width, you'll see that it gets rid of the gaps on either side and it makes it go all the way to either side of the screen. That's a personal preference visually, and it can be useful if you have a whole bunch of menu items where you need the extra space to move your logo over. You can click that. Unchecking it moves things in a bit more. If you for some reason don't even want to show your logo image, you can click that and it'll take it away. If you are showing your image, then these settings make a little bit more sense. The menu height, if we drag this, controls the vertical size of how big this bar is going to be. Now you notice when I clicked this, it also affected the size of my logo. This is a percentage right here where it says logo max height says 95%. So basically that means however big we allow the menu height to be, take up 95% of that space. That's how I've currently got it set. You can drag this down if you want your logo to progressively take up less and less of that space. The text size controls how big your navigation menu items are. If you want letter spacing, you can see how that starts gapping out how much space between each letter. That can be a cool stylistic effect, but as you can see, you start running out of space pretty quickly. So that's really only viable if you have a few options and not a big menu. This is where you can control the font that it's going to show for these things. That's the text color that it's going to show. You can see this is a green. Those are green. Active link color means if we were actually on any of these pages, see how that turned that blue to match this? That shows us visually, and any user that's on the site, that that's the page that they're on, and it's a different color than everything else in here. Background color of your menu, often I would go white. If you do want it to be a different color, you can pick that, and you notice that now your background has a color. If you're going to use a colored background, it's usually best to make sure that your logo is either set to the same color or has a transparent background so that it can be placed on top of any color and still look good. Drop down menu color you would use for, say, if you wanted that to look different, let's pick orange. Now you notice anytime there's a drop down here, it's going to use that orange. Drop down menu line color, you can see right there is the little dividing line. If you want it to be invisible, you can just basically pick white or whatever color you have this background to be, or you could use one of your brand colors. I've matched it to the same blue that's in this line of my logo so that they coordinate well, and I've set it to about the same thickness as well. Drop down menu text color, if you want these secondary items to be a different color than the top layer, you can declare it there. And this is the effect for when they pop in and out. By default, it's on fade. If you want it to slide open or do a fancy flip, you can select that out of that menu too. Secondary menu bar generally is one that optionally goes on top of your primary area, and you can see it on some themes where it offers the ability to make a phone call or do an email, and you can do some of the same settings in there. I have mine disabled just because stylistically I just prefer it to only show this at the top. Fixed navigation settings. By default, this is on in Divi, and that makes it so that as I scroll down here, you see how this shrunk in size to take up less of the screen. And the thought behind that is, if they're scrolling down, they're probably not anymore interested in looking at this menu, so it should go smaller to take up less of the screen, but still be there in case while they're halfway down the page, they decide they want to start looking at some of your other pages. And you can control the look of that here. What size does it shrink down to? What size does the text become? Do you want some of the colors to switch and be different? You can control all that in there. And I believe, no. Oh, and by the way, you'll see these down at the bottom here. This shows what the site looks like as a preview on a desktop computer. This is tablet and this is phone. If you click any of these, it will actually give you an approximation of what your site looks like in either of those modes. It's not perfect. Sometimes I've encountered where I've actually gone to a site I'm working on a phone and it looks slightly different than what this is assuming. But generally, this is a fairly good way to check changes that you're making to make sure that it looks like you want it to, more or less, on the different devices. That's a quick little way to check that. And that's another thing we'll get into when we get into the online page builder as well. One other thing that I wanted to show you when we're in here, some of this is just worth playing around. It's fairly straightforward to click through and play with yourself. I'm not going to go through literally everything because this video would be really long. I'm just going to cover some of the main things that you most likely want to look at when you're setting a site up for the first time. So under footer, I'm going to scroll down so that we can see the footer portion of the site. Under layout, this is where you can tell it how many columns you want. You notice that I have 3 columns. This is a text area. That's a text with my face. And then that's a little extra thing there. And this corresponds to that. If I wanted that to instead be 2 columns, you'll notice that now these are just 2 and it wraps the third. Oh, no. You notice that these are now 2 and it doesn't even show the third one anymore. And it scales the size to take up all the available room. If I now wanted 4, it shrinks them down so that there's room for a 4th one over here. And you can set the background color that it's going to use by default for all of the footer area right there. Under widgets, this is where you tell it by default how it's going to handle texts and things like that you end up putting in here. This is going to be similar to what we've already looked at. The header size, anytime you use a title on your widgets, that's considered the widget header, so you can control that size here, and again, whether it's bold, italicized, you can control its size, etc., like we've already seen. You can control the text color. Since I've used a very dark background, I've used white for the body text so that it stands out well. And for links, you notice that normally I've used a blue in my content, but the blue doesn't show up as well down here, and so I've used sort of a lime green that I think jumps out a little better. You can control that there. Same with the header colors. Footer elements. This is where you can toggle whether those buttons show or not. If I click this on, you'll notice in the settings I had earlier, I did have a Twitter and an RSS set up. That's where they pop in. If you uncheck that, it's going to take those away. That's up to you whether you want to show them. Footer menu. I'm not currently using a footer menu. You can control that under Appearance and Menus. It's a separate menu from your main navigation. Some websites like to do that, where they sort of reiterate a version of the main navigation down here so that when a person scrolls all the way down, they can see stuff again. Part of my rationale for not doing it is since I have it set so that the main navigation stays even when you scroll down, my thought is even if they're scrolled all the way down here and they want to navigate, they still have this. They don't need a whole other menu down here, and I don't like to make the bottom overly crowded, and so it's my judgment call not to do it. You're free to disagree, and if you want a menu, this is where you control the one that's down on the bottom. Bottom bar refers to this bar down here. That sits below where you're putting your footer widgets. That's where you can set a background color, the text color that you're going to use down there, the font styles. If you had activated the social icons, this is where you can select their size, make them bigger or smaller, and you can pick what color they're going to be. And then footer credits is this part right here, basically where you're giving the copyright info about your site. Anything you type in there is going to show right there. You'll probably be using some types of call to action buttons throughout the site, which you can find here under buttons, button style. This is again going to be a universal default. Anything we set in here is going to be anytime you use buttons in the builder that we're going to cover, by default, this is what the buttons are going to look like. It is a good idea if you have something in mind where maybe you say, I want all my buttons to have a red background with white text and to have this type of rounding on them and this sizing. You can do all that in here, and then every time you use a button, it'll just automatically be that way. I haven't done that in my case because I ended up doing custom styles on some of the buttons and then just saving the buttons to recall. It's a equally viable workaround that you don't need to worry about in here. There's no particular reason I chose not to do it in here. And I certainly encourage you to do that if you definitely think that you are going to have consistent call to action buttons that are generally going to be the same style. This is a good place to set that up. Hover style is the same idea, but that's going to tell it when the mouse cursor is over the button. Does it look different visually. That's kind of a cool way to just reinforce to the user when they hover that it is an action item that's going to do something, and so you can control what that does there. Additional CSS is like we mentioned before. This is where that custom code that you can put in is. And the reason I said earlier I didn't like to edit it there and I prefer to edit it here is because, as we see, any changes that we're making here we can see happen in real time on the site. So anytime I'm doing code changes here, I like to be able to watch it happen to make sure I'm doing it right and that it's sized in whatever the way that I intended. And then when you're done with this or any other changes that you're making back here, you can click Publish, and it will apply all of those changes to your site. If you've done a bunch of stuff and you decide, nah, I don't really want to do that, you can just click this X here, and it will leave the customizer without saving any of what you've done. In a nutshell, that's pretty much the basic walkthrough of the theme customizer to get things set up initially with Divi, and you can pop back into those settings from time to time to make tweaks as needed. But that's pretty much what I wanted to cover for this. Then the main next part is going to be using the Divi Builder on each actual page to set up what they look like. So I'll see you in the next one.